On the night of September 30th, 1888, Whitechapel was loud with voices, music, argument, and rain. Inside public houses, men drank and sang. Inside lodging houses, women counted coins and worried whether they had enough for a bed. And in a narrow, unlit yard just off Berner Street, a woman lay dying on cold stone. Her name was Elizabeth Stride. History often remembers her as an interruption. The victim Jack the Ripper didn't have time to mutilate. But Elizabeth Stride did not exist merely to be killed. She lived 45 years before that night. She crossed borders, spoke more than one language, worked, married, lied, drank, quarreled, reconciled, and survived systems that were stacked against her. To understand how she died, we must understand how she lived, and to do that, we must follow her footsteps. Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter on November 27, 1843, on a small farm called Stora Tumleyhead in Torslanda parish, just north of Gothenburg. This was not a romantic rural childhood. It was a life defined by physical labor, limited education, and few prospects, especially for girls. She was baptized at Torslanda Church and confirmed there as a teenager. Official records note that she could read tolerably well, but had little understanding of scripture, a small detail that hints at a practical intelligence rather than religious devotion. At 16, Elizabeth did what many rural girls did. She left home. In October 1860, she moved south into Gothenburg to work as a domestic servant. The city offered wages, but also dangers. By her early 20s, her circumstances had deteriorated. In March 1865, she was registered by police as a prostitute. This was not a criminal label, but a regulatory one. Prostitution was legal in Sweden as long as the woman registered herself with the police and submitted to compulsory medical exams. That same year, Elizabeth gave birth to a stillborn child. Soon afterward, she was admitted to Kråhuset, a hospital for venereal disease. In her case, almost certainly syphilis. In February 1866, Elizabeth applied to leave Sweden. She chose London, a city already famous for swallowing the desperate. Elizabeth arrived in London in the summer of 1866 by way of ship from Gothenburg to Hull, then by train from Hull to London. She registered at St. Petrus Kyrka, the Swedish church in Prince's Square, St. George in the east. The church functioned as a cultural anchor, a place where immigrants could receive charity, paperwork, and familiarity in an alien city. London was enormous, loud and indifferent. Elizabeth was now a foreign woman with an accent, few connections, and no family safety net. In March 1869, she married John Thomas Stride, a ship's carpenter, at St. Giles in the Fields Church in Holborn. For the first time, Elizabeth gained something resembling stability. The Strides lived in Poplar on East India Dock Road. They opened a small coffee shop first there, then relocated to Crisp Street, then Upper North Street, and finally 178 Poplar High Street. For nearly a decade, Elizabeth lived a recognizably working-class married life. Then it unraveled. By the late 1870s, Elizabeth was telling a tragic story that her husband and children had been killed in the Princess Alice disaster on the Thames, and that she herself had been injured while escaping. None of this was true. John Stride was still alive. There is no evidence they had children together. But the lie matters. It tells us that Elizabeth understood how sympathy worked. Widowhood carried moral authority. Tragedy softened judgment. In a city that blamed women for their own poverty, grief could be currency. By 1881, Elizabeth was sick and destitute. She entered the Whitechapel infirmary for bronchitis and was discharged directly into the Whitechapel workhouse on Berner Street. A system designed not to help, but to deter. She was now sliding downward. From 1882 onward, Elizabeth Stride's center of gravity became Flower and Dean Street in Spitalfields, one of the poorest streets in London. Common lodging houses charged nightly. If you didn't earn, you didn't sleep indoors. Elizabeth worked where she could, sewing or cleaning. When desperate, she sold sex. She was arrested repeatedly for drunkenness and disorderly conduct. Round 1885, Elizabeth began living with Michael Kidney, a dock labourer 7 years younger than her. They lived together on Devonshire Street, just off Commercial Road. Devonshire Street was infamous, even for Whitechapel, for its absolute and abject poverty. Their relationship was volatile. Elizabeth drank. She disappeared for days. Kidney tried to control her movements, even attempting to lock her in when she went out. This was not a safe relationship, but it was shelter. By September 1888, Whitechapel was gripped by terror. 2 women had already been murdered. The newspapers screamed warnings. Vigilante rumors spread. Elizabeth knew all of this, but fear did not pay for beds. On Tuesday, September 25, 1888, Michael Kidney saw Elizabeth for the last time at their room on Devonshire Street. She did not come home that night. On Wednesday, she returned to Flower and Dean Street, telling fellow lodgers she had quarreled with the man she lived with. Elizabeth stayed at the lodging house through Thursday and Friday. On Saturday, September 29th, she cleaned rooms and earned 6pence, enough for a bed if she returned. She left that evening, expecting to come back. By late Sunday night, September 30th, Berner Street was alive despite the rain. Music drifted from the International Working Men's Educational Club at numbers 4042. Voices echoed off brick walls. Lamps threw uneven pools of yellow light across doorways and gateways. Elizabeth Stride was moving slowly through this environment, not rushing, not fleeing, but lingering. Witness after witness described her standing, talking, leaning against walls. This was not the behavior of a woman panicked by danger. It was the behavior of someone negotiating. At approximately 12:35 a.m., Police Constable William Smith saw Elizabeth on the east side of Berner Street, opposite the club. She was speaking with a man described as young, respectably dressed, wearing a dark coat and a hard hat, and carrying a parcel wrapped in newspaper. The interaction appeared calm. Nothing suggested immediate violence. But less than 10 minutes later, the situation changed. At approximately 12:45 a.m., Israel Schwartz, a Hungarian Jewish immigrant living at 22 Helen Street, Back Church Lane, turned from Commercial Road into Berner Street. As he walked south, he approached the gateway leading into Dutfield's yard, the same entrance where Elizabeth Stride would shortly be found dead. Standing in that gateway, Schwartz saw a man stop and speak to a woman. Schwartz later identified the woman, without hesitation, as Elizabeth Stride. What happened next was sudden and violent. According to Schwartz's statement, the man attempted to pull Elizabeth into the street. When she resisted, he turned her around and threw her down onto the footway. Elizabeth screamed, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard. Schwartz recalled 3 distinct cries. This moment is critical. Elizabeth was not silently ambushed. She was conscious, resisting, and calling out. Schwartz crossed to the opposite side of the street, shaken by what he had seen. As he did, he noticed a second man standing nearby, lighting a pipe. This man did not intervene. Then, the first man shouted a single word, Lipski. In the charged atmosphere of Whitechapel in 1888, the word carried weight. It was a common anti-Semitic slur, recently made infamous by the execution of Israel Lipski for murder. Schwartz believed the shout was directed at him, an insult meant to intimidate. Moments later, Schwartz became frightened that the second man might be following him. He hurried away,
eventually breaking into a run beneath the railway arch on Fairclough Street. When he looked back, he saw that he was no longer being followed. Schwartz did not report the incident immediately. As a foreigner with limited English and as a Jew in a district already boiling with suspicion, he had reason to fear involvement. When he later gave his statement, he was taken to the mortuary and identified Elizabeth Stride's body as the woman he had seen thrown down. The encounter described by Israel Schwartz is one of the most debated moments in the entire Jack the Ripper case. If Schwartz is correct, then Elizabeth Stride was attacked in the open street minutes before her death. This raises difficult questions. Why was she not killed immediately? Why were there no defensive wounds? Why was the murder carried out quietly inside the yard, with no further screams? Some investigators believe that the man Schwartz saw was the killer, and that the assault escalated moments later inside Dutfield's yard. The police themselves expressed uncertainty. Official memoranda note significant discrepancies between Schwartz's description of the man and that given by Police Constable Smith only minutes earlier. Schwartz's account introduces the possibility that two men were involved, either together or separately. The first man, aggressive, physical, described as about 30 years old, around 5'5", with dark hair and a small mustache, wearing a dark overcoat and a wide-brimmed felt hat. The second man, passive, observant, standing back, lighting a pipe. Were they accomplices, or was the second man merely a bystander? But what matters is this: Elizabeth Stride was alive, conscious, and resisting less than 15 minutes before she was found dead. Dutfield's yard was not a hidden place, but it was a forgotten one. The yard lay just off Berner Street, accessed through a narrow gateway beside the International Workingmen's Educational Club at numbers 40, 42. By day, it served as a service entrance and storage area. By night, it was dark, unlit, and invisible from the street unless one stood directly at its mouth. Sometime after the assault witnessed by Israel Schwartz, Elizabeth Stride entered, or was guided into, that gateway. What happened in the next few minutes is unknowable. There were no eyewitnesses inside the yard. No cries were heard after Schwartz walked away. Whatever violence occurred there was swift, controlled, and terrifyingly quiet. Elizabeth was found lying on her left side, her face turned toward the wall, her feet pointing back toward the street she had just come from. This positioning matters. It suggests familiarity with the space, or compliance, or sudden domination, not a prolonged struggle. Her throat was cut with a single deep incision. The blade entered beneath the angle of the jaw on the left side and severed the carotid artery. Death would have followed quickly, though not instantly. There were no defensive wounds, no evidence of a fight. Unlike other victims, her body bore no mutilations, no abdominal injuries, no symbolic violence beyond the fatal cut itself. At approximately 1 a.m., Louis Diemschutz, a Jewish immigrant and club steward, drove his pony and cart into Dutfield's yard. A pony suddenly stopped and shied, refusing to move forward. Diemschutz leaned down and struck something soft with his whip. In the darkness, he could see nothing. At first, he believed a drunken woman had collapsed in the yard. This was not unusual in Whitechapel. He entered the pub to fetch assistance. When he returned with several men, they struck a match. Elizabeth Stride was already dead. The body was still warm. The blood had not yet fully congealed. Dr. Frederick Blackwell, summoned from nearby Commercial Road, arrived at 1:16 a.m. and pronounced her dead at the scene. Diemschutz would later state that he believed the killer had been in the yard moments before his arrival, perhaps even still there when the pony stopped. If that is true, then Elizabeth Stride's murder occurred within a window of minutes, bounded tightly by witness sightings, a violent assault, and the arrival of the cart. It is one of the most precisely timed murders in the entire Whitechapel series. When dawn came to Whitechapel on October 1st, 1888, Berner Street looked much as it always did. The rain had washed the blood away.
Shopkeepers raised their shutters. Workers walked past Dutfield's yard without knowing, or without stopping to look. Elizabeth Stride's body was gone. She had been taken to St. George's Mortuary on Cable Street, where doctors examined her not as a person, but as evidence. Measurements were taken. Clothing was catalogued. Possessions were listed. A thimble, scraps of fabric, a broken comb, a spoon, a piece of pencil. The contents of a life that fit into pockets. She was described clinically. Age, height, missing teeth, as though these details could somehow explain why she was dead. The inquest that followed focused, as inquests often do, on the mechanics of death rather than the meaning of a life. Witnesses spoke of sightings, of hats and coats, of minutes and seconds. Elizabeth herself was largely absent from the discussion. She appeared only as the deceased. Within hours, public anger boiled over. Crowds gathered in Berner Street, shouting at police, accusing them of incompetence, demanding protection. Pamphlets were printed. Rumors spread. The name Jack the Ripper hardened into a symbol of fear. Elizabeth Stride became part of that symbol. Yet she had not lived as a symbol. She had lived as a woman, navigating the narrow margins of survival. She had crossed an ocean alone. She had worked when work was available, and begged when it was not. She had lived with men because it offered shelter, even when it cost her safety. She had told stories, not to deceive for sport, but to survive systems that rewarded tragedy and punished honesty. On her final night, Elizabeth did not behave recklessly. She behaved familiarly. She lingered in doorways. She spoke to men. She negotiated. She expected to return to Flower and Dean Street. That expectation is written into the small human acts she left behind. The green velvet entrusted to a friend, the sixpence carefully counted, the bed she believed she had earned. Even in death, she was interrupted. Her murder was cut short. Her body was spared mutilation, not by mercy, but by chance. And because of that interruption, she has often been treated as an anomaly, a technicality in the Ripper series, rather than a person whose life deserves examination on its own terms. Elizabeth Stride was 45 years old. In Victorian Whitechapel, that made her old. She was aging out of the few fragile protections available to women like her. Each year narrowed her options. Each night carried more risk. She did not die because she was careless. She died because she was visible, poor, and unprotected, in a city that consumed such women without consequence. On Saturday, October 6th, Elizabeth Stride was buried in East London Cemetery, in Plaistow, in a grave paid for by the parish. There was no headstone bearing her name. No family stood at the graveside. No one spoke publicly about the girl born in Torslanda, or the young woman who crossed the sea to London. And yet she endures. She endures in court records, in parish registers, in witness statements, and in the streets themselves. Berner Street still exists, renamed but recognizable. Flower and Dean Street is gone, but its history lingers. These places remember her, even when people do not. And there is one more reason Elizabeth Stride's death matters. Less than an hour after her body was discovered, another woman was killed. Catherine Edwards was murdered in Mitre Square, inside the City of London, sometime between 1:30 and 1:44 a.m. Her body was mutilated in the manner now grimly familiar, the violence that Elizabeth Stride had been spared. The proximity in time binds the two women together forever. Whether committed by the same hand or not, their deaths unfolded as part of the same night, the same terror, the same failure of protection. Elizabeth Stride's murder was not an ending, it was a prelude. In that sense, Elizabeth Stride did not interrupt the Ripper. The night continued without her. Catherine Eddowes would become the fourth canonical victim.
Elizabeth Stride became the woman history struggled to categorize. Not fully fitting the pattern, not easily dismissed.
Together, they remind us of the scale of what was happening in Whitechapel and beyond. Women moving through the city after midnight because they had no safer option. And men free to vanish into the dark. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes never met, but they died on the same night, within an hour of each other, both caught in a geography of neglect that stretched from Berner Street to Mitre Square. Elizabeth Stride was not just a Ripper victim. She was Elizabeth Gustafsdotter, daughter of Swedish farm labourers. She was a migrant. She was a wife. She was a cleaner, a seamstress, a survivor of institutions designed to erase individuality. She mattered before she was killed. And she matters still, not because of the man who cut her throat, but because of the life she lived walking the streets of Whitechapel, one careful step at a time.